This video was made possible by Sacred Rites, an initiative based at Northeastern University that provides resources and trainings for scholars committed to the public understanding of religion. When you think of sacred places, what comes to mind? Maybe the Western Wall in Jerusalem, the Great Mosque in Mecca, or the city of Varanasi in India. But what about Syracuse, New York? Living in Boston, I had no idea that I was only a few hours away from another ancient sacred place, Lake Onondaga, right next to Syracuse, a sacred site for the Haudenosaunee people, also called the Iroquois Confederacy by outsiders. I'm not surprised that I knew nothing about it. Indigenous religions are understudied in my field, and religious studies textbooks barely mention them. To make matters worse, the public understanding of indigenous religions is full of stereotypes like dream catchers and sage bundles. I wanted to learn more about indigenous religions, so I teamed up with an expert, Abel Gomez, a PhD candidate at Syracuse University, and flew out there to meet him. We started on the banks of Lake Onondaga itself. So I'm here with Abel Gomez. How would you describe your expertise, Abel?
So I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of Religion at Syracuse University, focusing on contemporary indigenous religions.
Nice. And where are we right now?
So we are at Onondaga Lake in what is now Liverpool, New York, and it's the birthplace of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, or what some call the Iroquois, original 5 nations that at this lake accepted the Great Law of Peace and became the Haudenosaunee, or the people of the Longhouse.
The Haudenosaunee are comprised of 6 nations. According to oral tradition, these nations used to be at war, but then a man called the Peacemaker came to the house of an Onondaga leader named Hiawatha to help him forge a lasting peace between these people. It was here at Lake Onondaga that they buried their weapons of war and created the Great Law of Peace, a set of principles and governance that the Haudenosaunee nations live by to this day. Some say it's the earliest example of a representative democratic government in North America, in which delegates from each nation are sent to a Grand Council. The Hiawatha Belt represents the unified Haudenosaunee nations. When I visited their education center in New York, I noticed that they were flying it as a flag outside. So here I was, standing by what to me was just a normal lake in suburban New York, but to the Haudenosaunee people is an ancient sacred site deeply tied not only to their religious practice, but also to their mythology and politics. I left Syracuse feeling like I had a huge gap in my education, from high school all the way through my PhD program, and that gap was indigenous religions. The religious practices of indigenous people are super diverse. You have coming-of-age ceremonies like the flower dance among the Hupa, ancestor-honoring festivals like Dia de los Muertos. You have healing practices and world renewal ceremonies. Indigenous is one word that describes thousands of distinct cultures, languages, and governments. The UN estimates there are 370 million indigenous people globally. There are 570 tribal nations recognized in the US, more than 600 First Nations in Canada, and over 500 indigenous nations in Australia. I can't possibly cover all of this diversity in just a few videos, so where do we start? Abel and I wrote this video together, and we decided the best way to start is with the basic questions: what do we mean by indigenous religions, and how do we study them? The idea is to provide you with an analytical toolbox that you can use to study indigenous religions rather than a bunch of trivia about them. First, what do we mean by indigenous? Outsiders often reduce indigenous identity to culture, or more recently, genetics. The whole idea that you can figure out if you're indigenous just by taking a DNA test. A better way to think about indigenous identity can be summarized by 3 words: relationship, responsibility, and resurgence. Indigenous people typically speak of their relationship to their specific tribe or nation, often in terms of family connections. For example, for the Haudenosaunee people, your identity is often rooted in your maternal lineage through your clan, which is essentially an extended family unit led by a clan mother. Indigeneity is also about how your relationship to your tribe or nation informs responsibilities. Responsibilities to community or specific ancestral lands that your people have lived on for thousands of years, like Onondaga Lake. Or responsibilities to other than human entities like animals or spirits. For example, the Winnemem-Wintu, a tribe in California, speak of important relations with the salmon, while the Lakota speak of kinship with the buffalo. We can also think of indigeneity in terms of resurgence against ongoing colonialism. It'd be irresponsible for me to talk about indigenous religions without talking about them in the context of colonialism. We can look at Lake Onondaga again for an example. Following the American Revolution, the US government seized the Hautenosaunee's land and sold the land to settlers. To this day, the Haudenosaunee have tried to reassert their claim to this land in New York, but the Supreme Court rejected their claim as recently as 2013. I'll get back to colonialism later in this video, but what about religion in this context? Like the word indigenous, the word religion is also very contested. There aren't always words in indigenous languages that easily translate to the idea of religion. So how do we study them? The religious studies scholar Dennis Kelly has offered a different model to study indigenous religions, summarized by the words place, power, and protocol. Place refers to geography and the practices that emerge from specific territories. I've been talking a lot about land so far, so this shouldn't come as a surprise. A key characteristic of indigenous religions is deep relations to place or land.
So it's important to then think about how relationship to land, as expressed in many creation stories, really is about how land is relative. This is very different from the ways that most non-native people speak about land in terms of dead matter or an object that can be bought, that can be possessed. For most native people, it's relative. It's an ancestor. It's a person rather than an object. And so this creates very different understandings of religion.
In indigenous religions, land is the root of indigenous languages, mythology, and politics. Land is often the central actor and author of sacred practices too. Now, we've already talked a lot about Onondaga Lake for the Haudenosaunee, but another example includes Mauna Kea for Native Hawaiians, the volcano on the island of Hawaii. And the Hawaiian creation story, the earth and sky created Mauna Kea. Native Hawaiians speak of the mountain as their elder sibling, which suggests an important familial connection to that land. Next, we have power. Indigenous religions often focus on the sacred power localized and alive in the landscape. Sacredness is also applied to particular people, objects, and time of the year, too. And finally, protocol, the appropriate way to be in relation to land, humans, and the other-than-human worlds. We can think of protocol in terms like ceremony or ritual, too. The communal practices that allow people to fulfill ceremonial obligations to a specific community or a specific sacred landscape. Defining religion might sound like a bunch of useless academic exercises, but defining what counts as religion has been central to the policing of indigenous peoples, but also important for their survival. Throughout U.S. history, indigenous religious ceremonies were banned. For example, the Indian Religious Crimes Code of 1883 in the U.S. threatened to imprison anyone for practicing indigenous dances. But at the same time, indigenous peoples have also strategically used the term religion to protect their practices. Like in the 1920s, Pueblo peoples in what is now New Mexico used the term religion and used religious freedom policies to protect their ceremonial dances from persecution. In 1978, the U.S. government formally legalized the practice of American Indian religions through the American Indian Religious Freedom Act. But even this law hasn't always worked to protect indigenous religious practices. In one case in 1988, the new law did not halt the construction of a road through the Chimney Rock area of the Six Rivers National Forest in California, which is a sacred place for the Yurok, Karuk, and Tolowa tribes. These two approaches can help us better understand indigenous religions in general. You can approach any indigenous religion and ask, what is their relationship to land? What responsibilities and sacred practices do you see oriented towards the powers alive in that landscape or in a specific person? How have colonial powers disrupted and continue to disrupt their religious practices? It's a set of questions that you can use when studying indigenous religions, but there are some key takeaways to keep in mind. First, it's important to remember that while indigenous religions have ancient roots, they're not primitive or frozen in time like some scholars of religion once thought. Early religious studies scholars like Emil Durkheim thought that we could study the origins of religion, what he would call primitive religion, by studying indigenous peoples. His famous book, The Elementary Forms of Religious Life, which every first-year PhD student needs to read, was based off of anthropological studies of native Australian tribes conducted by a few European guys in the late 1800s. But these communities are dynamic and active. Religions change over time, and that's no different with Indigenous religions. So it's a mistake to study 20th century Native Australian beliefs and practices and assume that you're studying religion as it was in the Paleolithic period. Secondly, it's impossible to study Indigenous religions without studying them in the context of colonialism. But we can distinguish between two types of colonialism: extractive and settler colonialism. I'll let Abel define these.
I think, need to talk about colonialism as the expansion of one nation into another territory. So often this is phrased in terms of extractive colonialism or settler colonialism. So when we talk about extractive colonialism, we're talking about a nation going to a place, setting up temporary living situation, extracting resources, but eventually heading out. So an example of this is like British colonialism in India. They left, and they left a big mess. Settler colonialism is different in that the intention of settlement is permanent, and that in the process, the indigenous peoples have to be erased. So in the US, this meant the forced removal of indigenous peoples and the forced arrival of enslaved Africans as a free labor force to control the land.
Now, much of this dates back hundreds of years to the Doctrine of Discovery, a series of 15th century documents issued by the Vatican that directed Christian explorers to claim lands in Africa and the Americas. For example, a letter called Romanus Pontifex from the Pope instructed the King of Portugal to invade, conquer, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans, to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, and to take away all their possessions and property. Okay, this might sound outdated, but the effects of the Doctrine of Discovery have become part of modern US property law and federal Indian law. In the Johnson versus McIntosh case of 1823, the US Supreme Court affirmed the Doctrine of Discovery, which set a precedent for rulings against indigenous land claims for decades to come. It was even cited in 2005 in Sherrill versus Oneida Indian Nation, a case that ultimately ruled against returning tribal lands of central New York to the Oneida Nation. We continue to see this into the 21st century, with major stories like the fight to stop the construction of an oil pipeline through the Standing Rock Sioux territory, or Native Hawaiians protesting the construction of the 30-meter telescope on Mauna Kea. If we understand that religion continues to be at the heart of various indigenous movements, we can understand what's at stake when indigenous lands and waters are polluted, or when peoples are exiled from their lands. Learning about these traditions invites non-natives to consider our relationship to indigenous peoples. These religions also challenge us to expand our understanding of religion toward a focus on practice and communal responsibilities, and what it means to live within a sacred landscape. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.